The last gunshot echoed through the Hillsville courthouse, and then a silence fell, a silence heavier and more terrible than any sound before it. Through the thick grey smoke of black powder, the afternoon light struggled to reveal a scene of absolute carnage. The judge, the sheriff, the prosecutor, the very pillars of the law lay bleeding onto the floorboards. The assassins, the notorious Allen clan, had already vanished back into the mists of the Blue Ridge Mountains. This wasn't just murder. It was a declaration of war against the 20th century itself. What could possess men to commit such a brazen act in broad daylight? What unwritten code could be so powerful that it demanded a bloodbath in a hall of justice? To find the answer, we must look past the men who fired the guns, to the woman who forged their iron will in the heart of the mountains. Today, we uncover the story of Barbara Allen, the matriarch of a clan that answered to no law but her own. Hillsville, Virginia, in the spring of 1912, was a town caught between two worlds. Down its muddy main street, you could see the slow, inexorable march of the 20th century in the form of new storefronts and the occasional motor car. But looking up at the surrounding Blue Ridge, you could feel the pull of the old world, a world of isolated hollows, deep-rooted clans, and unwritten laws that had governed these mountains for generations. The brick courthouse stood as the very symbol of this struggle, a place where the new rule of law was meant to replace the old code of blood and honor. At the heart of this new order was Judge Thornton Massey. He wasn't a local man, not born of the same mountain soil as the families he presided over. He was an outsider, an educated man of principle who believed that justice should be blind. To him, a man's last name shouldn't matter, whether it was Allen or Smith. The law was the law, a universal standard that was meant to tame the wildness of the frontier and bring civilization to the hills. He was a stern but fair-minded man, tasked with the impossible job of imposing a foreign authority on a people who had never recognized any authority but their own kin. Sheriff Lewis Webb, on the other hand, was a man of the county. He had to walk a delicate line every single day. He wore a badge representing the government in the state capital, but he lived and worked among neighbors who settled their disputes with fists or a hunting rifle. He knew the Allens. He understood their pride, their temper, and their profound contempt for his office. Every time he served a warrant in a remote holler, he was stepping into a world where his badge meant less than nothing. He was the local embodiment of a law that many saw as an occupying force. Alongside them stood William Foster, the Commonwealth's attorney. He was the voice of the system, the man who used words and legal precedent to fight battles that were more often settled with threats and intimidation. He believed in due process, in evidence, in the power of a logical argument to uncover the truth. In that Hillsville courtroom, he was preparing to argue a case against Floyd Allen, not realizing he was bringing a book of rules to a gunfight. These men were not just public officials. They were pioneers of a new way of life. They were husbands, fathers, and respected members of a community trying to build a future based on order and reason. But a shadow was gathering over them, a tension that was palpable in the cold March air. The upcoming trial of Floyd Allen wasn't just another case on the docket. It was a test of will. It was a direct challenge to the Allen clan's belief that they were a law unto themselves. The world these men were trying to build was one where disagreements were settled by juries, not ambushes. A world where a judge's gavel was more powerful than a patriarch's command. They woke up on the morning of March the 14th, believing in that world, in the safety of their courthouse, and in the strength of the laws they had sworn to uphold. They had no idea that by day's end, their world would be left in ruins, and their bodies would be the final, bloody evidence of a war that had been brewing for centuries. The Hillsville courthouse was no longer a place of law. It was a slaughterhouse. As the acrid fog of gunpowder began to settle, it revealed a scene of pure pandemonium. Men and women who moments before had been calm spectators scrambled for the exits, their screams echoing in the suddenly cavernous room. Those who remained were frozen in shock, staring at the carnage with wide, uncomprehending eyes. The air, thick with the smell of sulfur and fear, hummed with a terrible ringing silence where the rule of law had just been executed. The first people to rush in found Judge Massey slumped behind his bench, the symbol of his authority, now his deathbed. His gavel lay on the floor beside him, a useless piece of wood in a world where steel and lead had spoken the final word. Near the main door, Sheriff Lewis Webb lay fallen, a testament to his final futile attempt to restore order. Across the room, Commonwealth's attorney William Foster was also down, his legal arguments silenced forever. It was a systematic dismantling of the county's legal system carried out in less than 2 minutes. The evidence of the ambush was everywhere. The floor was littered with spent shell casings, glinting like deadly seeds sown on the hardwood. Bullet holes peppered the walls, the witness stand, and the judge's bench, silent witnesses to the storm of violence. Investigators would later count dozens of impacts, a clear sign of multiple shooters firing with reckless abandon. The Allens' chairs were empty. They had simply stood up, unleashed hell, and melted back into the mountains that had raised them, leaving only chaos and death in their wake. The scene offered no mystery as to who was responsible. Every terrified whisper from the survivors confirmed it: the Allens. But the how and the why were a far darker puzzle. How could a family bring a private army into a courtroom? Was this a spontaneous explosion of mountain temper or a cold, calculated assassination? The contradictory accounts from traumatized witnesses only deepened the confusion. The crime scene itself was a brutal message, written in blood and gunpowder. In these mountains, some lines of kinship were thicker than any law, and the price for crossing them was absolute. If you were to search for the man at the eye of this hurricane, all fingers would have pointed to one person, Floyd Allen. He wasn't just a participant, he was the cause. Floyd was the patriarch, a man carved from the hard granite of the Blue Ridge who had amassed wealth, land, and a fearsome reputation. In his corner of Carroll County, his word was law, and his will was absolute. He moved through the world with the unshakable confidence of a king in his own kingdom, a place where the official law was an irritation, a suggestion from a distant world that he was free to ignore. His motive was as clear and cold as a mountain spring. It was pride, a fierce, unyielding pride that defined the very soul of the Appalachian clan system. The initial charge against him, interfering with an officer, was an insult. But the verdict, a year of hard time in the state penitentiary, was an intolerable humiliation. For a man like Floyd, a year in a prison uniform was not a punishment. It was an execution of his honor. It was the state declaring that he, Floyd Allen, was no better than any other man, that his power and his name meant nothing within the walls of their courthouse. The evidence was immediate and overwhelming. The shooting began the very second after Judge Massey pronounced the sentence. Witnesses recounted Floyd standing up, his face a mask of cold fury, and uttering the words that became the spark in the powder room, "I ain't a-goin'." That phrase, spoken with the full weight of his authority, was not a plea or a protest. It was a command. It was the signal to his kin that the time for talking was over. The community didn't need a detective to solve this mystery. They had all seen the simmering rage in Floyd Allen's eyes. He wasn't just a suspect. He was the epicenter of the earthquake that had just leveled the rule of law in Carroll County. But in the shadow of the patriarch stood a figure arguably more dangerous, Claude Allen, Floyd's son and heir apparent to this kingdom of defiance. Where Floyd's rage was born from a lifetime of power and a sudden public challenge to it, Claude's was something different. It was the pure, distilled poison of the Allen creed, passed down from one generation to the next. He was a true believer, a young man who had been taught from the cradle that the only response to an outside threat was overwhelming violence. The twist here is not one of greed or jealousy, but of ideology. Claude's motive was not simply to protect his father, it was to prove himself the worthy inheritor of the Allen legacy. For him, his father's conviction was a stain on his own honor. A year in prison for Floyd meant a lifetime of shame for Claude. He couldn't allow the world to see the Allens as a clan that could be tamed, caged, and broken by Flatlander laws. He was there not just to prevent a sentence, but to make a statement that would echo through the mountains for 100 years. When we re-examine the chaos of that day, one terrible detail rises to the surface. Most historical accounts and eyewitness testimonies agree. Claude Allen fired the first shot. He didn't wait for his father's signal. He didn't hesitate. As the judge pronounced the sentence, Claude drew his pistol and shot Judge Massey point blank. This was not the act of a man caught up in the heat of the moment. It was the act of an executioner. He didn't just join the fight, he started the war. In that single irrevocable moment, he betrayed any possibility of a non-violent outcome and sealed the fate of everyone in that room, turning a family's defiance into a public massacre. But to truly understand the firestorm at Hillsville, you have to look beyond the men and their motives to the larger war being waged. The true external threat wasn't a single person, but an entire century. The 20th century was coming for the Blue Ridge Mountains, not with a friendly handshake, but with the cold, calculating ambition of industry and centralized government. Railroads were cutting through ancient hills, timber barons were eyeing the vast virgin forests, and land speculators were using complex laws to divest mountain families of the very ground their ancestors had settled. This encroaching world saw the old ways of the mountains, the clan loyalty, the self-reliance, the deep suspicion of outsiders as a barrier to progress and profit. And the local instrument of this new world was the courthouse. Judge Massey, Sheriff Webb, and Prosecutor Foster were not just men doing their jobs, they were the local agents of this powerful external force. They represented a system that valued deeds and statutes over blood loyalty and tradition, a system that sought to replace the unwritten code of the mountains with the codified law of the state capital. From the Allens' perspective, this wasn't justice, it was a hostile takeover. Every new law, every tax, every court summons was another tightening of a noose around their way of life and their sovereignty. Floyd Allen's trial was the flashpoint. For the state, it was a necessary act to prove that no man was above the law. But for the Allens, it was the final, arrogant push of an invading army trying to break the back of the strongest clan in the county. The massacre, seen through this lens, becomes something more than a family's rage. It was a brutal, desperate act of rebellion against a future they did not want and a system they refused to recognize. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, the state of Virginia responded with a fury it had never before unleashed. Governor William Hodges Mann called it a blot on the name of the Commonwealth and vowed that the Allens would be hunted down like animals. He dispatched the state militia and, more importantly, hired the infamous Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, a private army of detectives known for their brutal and effective methods in breaking Union strikes. A massive manhunt, one of the largest in Virginia's history, was underway. But the lawmen and detectives quickly discovered they were not fighting men. They were fighting a legend, and their enemy was the land itself. The Blue Ridge Mountains, so beautiful from a distance, became a labyrinthine fortress for the fugitives. Every holler, every creek bed, every rhododendron thicket was a potential hiding place. The Allens knew the secret trails, the hidden caves, the sympathizers' cabins where a door would always be open. The detectives, with their city boots and their organized grid searches, were like children lost in an ancient, hostile forest. The pursuit became a frustrating and humiliating chase after phantoms. A tip would come in that the Allens had been spotted crossing into North Carolina, and a posse would ride for days, only to find the trail was cold, the rumor baseless. Another report would place them in a remote mining camp, but by the time the law arrived, the camp was deserted, with only the faint warmth of a recent fire as proof that anyone had been there at all. The Allens were a mist, dissolving whenever the law drew near, leaving the authorities grasping at nothing but fog and rumors. Back in Hillsville, the investigation into the crime itself was just as tangled. While everyone knew the Allens were guilty, The chaos of the shootout had created a dozen conflicting narratives. Who fired the first shot? Eyewitnesses, still reeling from the trauma, gave contradictory accounts. Some swore it was Claude Allen, others pointed to his cousin, Sidney Allen. The sheer number of guns fired made ballistic evidence a nightmare to sort through. For a brief moment, the state even pursued the theory that this was a wider conspiracy, a planned uprising against the government. But these trails led nowhere, circling back to the same frustrating truth. The Allens had acted as one, a single entity moved by a singular, violent purpose. The law was looking for a single mastermind, failing to understand they were fighting the spirit of an entire clan. The Baldwin Felts detectives soon learned a chilling lesson. The mountains were a fortress of rock and shadow, but the people who lived in them were a fortress of silence. As the manhunt dragged on, the lawmen came down from the cold, empty hillsides and tried to gather intelligence in the small communities and isolated farmhouses. What they encountered was a wall, as solid and impenetrable as a cliff face. Doors that had been opened to strangers were now bolted shut. Faces that were once friendly turned to stone. When asked about the Allens, the answer was always the same. Saw nothing, heard nothing, know nothing. This wasn't just a lack of cooperation, it was a deeply ingrained code of omerta, the unwritten law of the mountains. The first pillar of this code was fear, and it was a fear well earned. The Allens had ruled their corner of the county for decades through a mixture of influence and raw intimidation. To speak against them was to invite ruin. A farmer whose land bordered the Allens might find his best cow missing one morning, or his fence cut in the dead of night. A whisper to the sheriff could mean finding your barn burned to the ground a week later, with no one to blame but the shadows. The community knew the Allens' justice was swifter and more certain than any verdict from a distant court. But it was more than just fear. It was kinship. In the tangled genealogy of the Appalachian hollows, the Allen family tree had roots in every direction. They were connected by blood and marriage to half the families in the county. Asking someone to turn on the Allens was often asking them to betray a cousin, a brother-in-law, or a childhood friend. To these people, the lawmen from the city were the true outsiders, the invaders. The Allens, for all their violence, were their own. Loyalty to blood was a sacred duty that trumped any law written in a book. This wall of silence drove the detectives to the edge of madness. They were in a foreign country, surrounded by people who looked and spoke like them, but who lived by an ancient, invisible set of rules. The truth of the massacre wasn't a secret buried in the ground. It was a story being actively protected behind every locked door and every pair of cold, watchful eyes. The community had closed ranks, forming a silent army that was just as effective as the Allens' own guns at keeping the law at bay. Weeks turned into a month, and the mountains held their secret. The manhunt, for all its resources and manpower, was a spectacular failure. The Allens had been swallowed by the wilderness, and the wall of silence held firm. The detectives were frustrated, the governor was furious, and it began to look as if the Allen clan might have truly committed the perfect crime, disappearing into folklore as ghosts of the Blue Ridge. But the men from the Baldwin Felts agency were not mountain men. They were masters of human weakness, and they knew that every fortress has a crack. They shifted their strategy. They couldn't out-hike the Allens, so they decided to buy them. Massive reward notices were posted on every courthouse door, every general store window, every fence post from Virginia to Tennessee. The price on the Allens' heads grew to a small fortune, enough money to change a poor dirt farmer's life forever. They were no longer just hunting men with guns, they were hunting them with greed, planting a seed of temptation in the heart of the community. And then, it happened. The turning point came not with a shout, but with a whisper. A secret message, passed through a trusted intermediary, reached the detectives. It wasn't a grand confession, and it didn't come from a core member of the clan. It came from the periphery, from someone whose loyalty was weaker than their desire for the reward money, or perhaps someone who was simply tired of the chaos the Allens had brought down upon them all. The message contained the one thing the law had been missing: a specific location. A small farmhouse, a known sympathizer's home, where Floyd and Claude Allen were believed to be hiding. This was the forgotten clue they had been searching for. It wasn't an overlooked piece of evidence on the courthouse floor. It was a piece of human intelligence, pried loose from the wall of silence by the relentless pressure and the lure of cash. Suddenly, the vast, intimidating wilderness shrank to a single point on a map. The hunt was no longer a blind chase through an endless forest. It was a focused, surgical strike. The momentum had shifted. The Allens' greatest shield, the loyalty of their people, had finally been breached, and the lawmen now knew exactly where to find their prey. Under the cover of a moonless night, the law closed its iron fist around the farmhouse. The Baldwin Felts detectives, moving with the cold professionalism of seasoned hunters, took their positions, their rifles and shotguns aimed at every door and window. There would be no escape this time. The tip from their secret informant had been good. Inside that small wooden building were the two most wanted men in Virginia, Floyd and Claude Allen, the patriarch and the instigator. The air was thick with a silence that felt heavier than any sound, the calm before a final bloody storm. As the first light of dawn began to bleed over the mountain ridges, the call for surrender was issued. It was met not with words, but with the bright orange flash of a rifle from a darkened window, the sharp crack echoing across the valley. The farmhouse erupted in a blaze of gunfire. The Allens were not surrendering. They were making their last stand, turning a simple farmhouse into a fort and choosing to die in a blaze of glory rather than be taken alive. For hours, the siege raged, a furious exchange of lead that tore the small building to splinters. But the fight was hopeless. Surrounded and outgunned, the end came swiftly. In a final desperate rush, the detectives stormed the house. And then the legends were made of flesh and blood. Floyd Allen, the powerful patriarch, was found wounded. His fight bled out of him. The aura of invincibility shattered. He was no longer the king of Carroll County, but a captured, bleeding old man. His son Claude, the young firebrand who had started the massacre with a single shot, was also taken, his youthful fury finally extinguished by the overwhelming force of the law. As they were led out of the ruined farmhouse in chains, the full, horrifying truth of their motive was finally unmasked. It wasn't written in a hidden diary or a forgotten letter. It was written in the blood they had spilled and the defiance they had shown to the very end. This was never just about a minor charge or a one-year sentence. This was a battle for a way of life. They were soldiers in a war against a future that had no place for them, fighting for a code of honor that demanded violence against shame. The true culprit, the force that had driven them, was the unwritten law of the mountains, the creed that had been hammered into them since birth. The men who walked out of that farmhouse were the living, breathing products of Barbara Allen's terrible gospel, and Allen does not go to jail. In their capture, they had failed their code, but their final, desperate stand proved just how deeply they believed it. The chase was over, and the men behind the myth were finally exposed. Now, with the benefit of history, we can finally step back into that courtroom and witness the terrible harvest of the Allen creed. Picture the scene. The room is packed, the air thick with tension. Judge Thornton Massey, a man of the law, looks down from his bench. Below him stands Floyd Allen, a man of the mountains, surrounded by his kin. It is a standoff between two worlds, and the wooden walls of the courthouse have become the frontier. The judge's voice cuts through the silence, clear and firm, as he delivers the sentence, 1 year in the state penitentiary. The words hang in the air for a heartbeat, an intolerable insult. Floyd Allen draws himself up to his full height, his face like carved stone. He looks not at the judge, but at his own clan, and makes his declaration, a phrase that will become his epitaph. "I ain't a-goin'." Before the last syllable has faded, the room explodes. The first shot cracks like a whip, a sound so sharp and final it seems to suck all the air from the room. Judge Massey jerks backward, a look of stunned disbelief on his face, and then slumps forward over his bench. His gavel, the symbol of his authority, slides from his hand and clatters onto the floor below. That single sound breaks the spell, and hell is unleashed. The courtroom becomes a roaring, blinding vortex of chaos. Muzzle flashes from the Allen's pistols create strobing, hellish images in the suddenly dark, smoke-filled room. The noise is deafening, a continuous thunder that rattles the windows and shakes the floorboards. Men and women scream and dive for cover, crawling under heavy wooden benches as bullets splinter the wood just above their heads. Papers from the prosecutor's table are thrown into the air by the concussions, fluttering down through the haze like pale, terrified birds. Sheriff Webb, reacting on pure instinct, draws his revolver. He takes but a single step towards the Allens before he is thrown backward, falling near the doorway he was sworn to protect. Across the room, Commonwealth's Attorney Foster rises from his chair, his mouth open as if to object, but his argument is silenced forever as he too collapses to the floor. It is not a gunfight, it is an execution. Then, as suddenly as it began, the shooting stops. An unnatural ringing silence descends, broken only by the choked sobs of the survivors. The thick, acrid smoke of black powder hangs in the air, a suffocating fog that obscures everything. As it slowly begins to clear, the full horror is revealed. The chairs where the Allens had been sitting are empty, and on the walls, on the judge's bench, on the witness stand, are dozens of dark, round marks, the 57 silent witnesses to 90 seconds of absolute carnage. The Allen clan was gone, leaving behind only blood, smoke, and the shattered ruins of the law. The trial of Floyd and Claude Allen was not a legal proceeding, it was a public reckoning. The state of Virginia, its authority profoundly wounded, put the full weight of its power on display. The small town of Wytheville, where the trial was moved to ensure a less biased jury, became the center of a national media circus. Reporters from as far away as New York and Chicago descended, eager to capture every detail of what they called the Savage Mountain Feud. For the state, this was a show trial in the truest sense, a chance to prove, once and for all, that the law of the Commonwealth was stronger than any clan's code of honor. In the defendant's box, Floyd and Claude Allen were not broken men begging for mercy. They were defiant to the last. Floyd sat with the stoic, quiet dignity of a fallen king, his gaze steady, his contempt for the proceedings clear in every line of his weathered face. He listened to the testimony against him not as a criminal, but as a captured enemy general forced to endure the rituals of his conquerors. Beside him, his son Claude was a caged wolf, his eyes burning with an unrepentant fire. They offered no apologies, no explanations. They had lived by their code, and they would die by it. The prosecution's case was simple and brutal. This was a premeditated assassination of the law itself. They painted the Allens as a lawless tribe, a cancerous growth on the body of civilized society that had to be cut out. The defense, in a nearly impossible task, tried to argue that this was a tragedy of culture, a spontaneous eruption of violence born from the unique and volatile honor code of the mountains. They weren't trying to prove innocence. They were trying to explain a worldview that the jury box, filled with merchants and flatland farmers, could never possibly comprehend. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. When the jury foreman stood and pronounced both Floyd and Claude Allen guilty of murder in the first degree, a wave of relief and grim satisfaction washed over the courtroom. But the Allens themselves did not flinch. They had expected no quarter from this foreign court, and they were given none. The sentence followed swiftly: death in the state's electric chair. This final judgment was perhaps the ultimate symbol of the clash of worlds. The Allens had dealt in the hot, personal violence of the pistol. The state would answer with the cold, impersonal, technological power of electricity. In March of 1913, almost a year to the day after the massacre, father and son were executed. For the newspapers and the world outside, justice had been served. But back in the hollows of Carroll County, the story was far from over. The executions didn't end the legend, they cemented it. Floyd and Claude became martyrs, their deaths a final, terrible proof to many that the government's justice was just a more organized form of killing, a verdict that still sparks arguments in these hills to this day. The executions of Floyd and Claude Allen were not an end, but the beginning of a long, painful reckoning. The Allen clan, once a formidable power in the Blue Ridge, was shattered. Their name, once spoken with a mixture of respect and fear, now became a synonym for senseless murder. The clan's other key figures were systematically hunted down and brought to justice. Sidney Allen, Barbara's own son, was wounded in a shootout and captured. He, along with his uncle Sidney Allen, was sentenced to decades in the state penitentiary, a fate that, for men raised on a doctrine of absolute freedom, was a kind of living death. The Allens' land holdings diminished, their political influence evaporated, and their aura of invincibility was gone forever, replaced by a legacy of infamy. At the heart of this ruin sat Barbara Graham Allen, the matriarch who had planted the seeds of this destruction. She lived to see the catastrophic harvest of her teachings. She saw her brother-in-law and nephew sent to the electric chair. She saw her own son, Sidney, locked away in a cage. The central commandment of her life, Allen's "don't go to jail," had become a bitter, ironic prophecy. Her family had either been sent to their graves or to a prison cell, the ultimate humiliation she had raised them to avoid. She died in 1920, a lonely, unyielding woman surrounded by the ghosts of the men she had forged, her final years spent in the quiet desolation of a kingdom turned to ash. The scars on the community of Hillsville ran just as deep. The families of Judge Massey, Sheriff Webb, William Foster, and the others were left with an unfillable void. They were not just statistics in a famous crime, they were husbands, fathers, and brothers whose absence left a permanent wound on the town. For decades, the massacre was a shadow that hung over Carroll County, a topic spoken of in hushed tones. The event divided neighbors and created a legacy of bitterness and distrust that would take generations to heal. Hillsville was no longer just a quiet mountain town. It was now a landmark of American violence. The men who escaped the electric chair still paid a heavy price. Sidney and Sidney Allen served long years behind the bleak walls of the Virginia State Penitentiary. Sidney, in a final act of Allen defiance, managed a daring escape but was eventually recaptured. Both were eventually paroled, returning as old, broken men to a world that had moved on without them. They were relics of a bygone era, their lives a long, slow postscript to the 90 seconds of chaos that had defined them. The fire of their youth had been extinguished by the slow, grinding reality of prison life. The tragedy of Hillsville didn't just end with the trials or the prison sentences, it echoed down through the generations. The descendants of the Allen clan had to navigate a world where their last name was a mark of shame. The children of the victims grew up without fathers, their lives forever defined by the violence of that day. The fates of everyone touched by the massacre, perpetrator and victim, lawman and outlaw, remained forever intertwined, bound together by the blood that was spilled on the courthouse floor. The world may have moved on, but in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the past is never truly past. If you travel to Hillsville today, you will not find the brick courthouse where the massacre took place. It was tragically lost to a fire in the 1990s. But for 85 years, that building stood as the most tangible monument to the tragedy. Its exterior walls held the scars of that day, the dark, round pockmarks left by the Allens' guns. For generations, people made a kind of pilgrimage to that courthouse, not just to conduct business, but to run their fingers over those bullet holes, to touch the physical evidence of a day when the law was shot dead in its own home. The echoes of the story are etched in stone in the quiet cemeteries scattered throughout the county. In the Hillsville Cemetery, you can find the graves of Judge Massey, Sheriff Webb, and William Foster, their tombstones speaking of duty and a life cut short in service to the law. Miles away, in a family plot, lie the bodies of Floyd and Claude Allen, executed and buried back in the mountain soil that they fought and died for. Their graves, too, draw visitors, those who see them not as murderers, but as symbols of a fierce bygone independence. But the story's most enduring life is in the telling. The Hillsville Massacre seeped into the very soil of Appalachia and grew into folklore. For 100 years, it has been a cautionary tale told on front porches, a ghost story whispered around campfires. Local bards and balladeers captured the tragedy in song, and if you listen closely in the old-time music circles of the Blue Ridge, you might still hear the mournful tune of the Ballad of Floyd Allen, a song that turns the bloody tale into a timeless legend of pride and rebellion. More than anything, the mountains themselves remember. They were the silent witnesses to the Allens' flight, to the manhunt, and to the final, desperate siege. The wind that whispers through the pines on a cold night seems to carry the echoes of the gunshots. The old roads that twist through the hollows still feel as though they carry the memory of the posse's hoofbeats. History in these hills isn't just written in books or carved on monuments. It's a living presence in the landscape, a story the mountains will never let go of. So we return to the question that hung in the gunpowder smoke of that Hillsville courtroom. What could possess men to commit such an act? The easy answer is pride, or anger, or a primitive sense of justice. But the truth is that the most dangerous force in that room was not a man with a gun, but an idea. The idea that a family's honor was worth more than the law, worth more than another man's life, worth more than their own. This was the gospel according to Barbara Allen, a creed so powerful that it turned sons and nephews into soldiers in a war only they believed they were fighting. This is a story not just of a crime, but of a collision between two worlds. The Hillsville Massacre was the sound of an old world breaking against the shores of a new one. It is a brutal lesson in how a code of honor, once necessary for survival in a lawless frontier, can become a death sentence when the world changes. The Allens' fierce loyalty and unyielding pride were the very virtues that had made their ancestors strong. But in the 20th century, those same virtues led directly to the electric chair and the prison cell. Their story is a chilling reminder that the deadliest prisons are not always made of stone and steel, but are sometimes built from the unshakable beliefs passed down from one generation to the next. In the end, this is the tragedy of Barbara Allen. She was the unindicted architect of the massacre, a matriarch whose fierce love for her family's pride was so absolute that it demanded its utter ruin. She was not in the courtroom that day, but her spirit pulled every trigger. She won her battle. Floyd Allen never wore prison stripes, but in doing so, she lost everything. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story, or at least as much of it as the mountains are willing to give up. They say the law came to Perry County, Kentucky, on the back of a horse. But on a cold day in May of 1889, it died on the courthouse steps with a single rifle shot that echoed like a crack of doom. The man who fell was Judge Josiah Combs, a respected elder who believed the law was greater than any family's grudge. He was wrong. That single shot wasn't just a murder, it was the bloody climax of a war. How did a place like this descend into such savagery? What drove men to assassinate the very symbol of justice? Today, we trace the river of bad blood back to its source, to tell the ballad of the Perry County War. To understand the blood that was shed, you first have to understand the ground it soaked into. In the 1880s, Perry County wasn't just a place on a map. It was a world unto itself, walled in by the ancient, unblinking mountains of eastern Kentucky. The Kentucky River was its one slow artery to the outside, and news traveled up it on flatboats at a crawl. Life here was hard. carved out of the steep hillsides with an axe and a plough. A man's wealth was measured in the corn he grew, the hogs he raised, and the children who bore his name. In this isolation, a different kind of law took root. It wasn't written in any book, but every man, woman, and child knew it by heart. It was the mountain code. Family was everything. Your kin were your nation, your army, and your only true shield against a harsh world. An insult to your third cousin was an insult to you, and it had to be answered. A man's honor was his most sacred possession. It was a fragile thing, easily bruised by a stray word or a sideways glance, and once broken, it could only be mended with blood. The state government in Frankfurt was a distant rumor, and its laws were seen as suggestions at best, an unwelcome intrusion at worst. Justice was a personal matter, dispensed from the barrel of a Winchester rifle. Into this closed world, whispers of change began to drift. Men with strange accents and fancy surveying tools started appearing in the hollows. They were agents of the great northern corporations, geologists and timber scouts who saw something the local folk had taken for granted. They didn't see steep hillsides. They saw mountains of virgin hardwood. They didn't see rocky soil. They saw the richest seams of bituminous coal on God's green earth. The railroad, they promised, was coming. And with it would come a flood of money that would make the old ways of life seem like a dream. Suddenly, the prize wasn't just survival, it was a fortune. And the key to that fortune was locked inside a single building, the Hazard Courthouse. The men who held the offices of sheriff, county clerk, and judge didn't just keep records, they controlled the future. They oversaw the land deeds, they set the tax rates, and they enforced, or chose not to enforce, the law. Whichever clan controlled that courthouse would control who got rich and who got left behind when the coal boom hit. This was the Forge. It took the old mountain code of honor and family loyalty and superheated it with the coming fire of industrial greed. Every election became a battle, every political dispute a potential vendetta. The stage was being set for a war, fought not by soldiers in uniform, but by neighbors and cousins. They weren't just fighting for power anymore. They were fighting for the soul of the mountains, and they were willing to turn their home into a killing ground to win it. Before the shooting started, you could still see the men for who they were, not just the leaders of warring armies. Take Joe Eversole. He wasn't some wild-eyed mountain brawler. He was a man who fought with words, a lawyer who could tie a man in knots with a well-phrased argument in the Hazard Courthouse. He'd sit with his family on his porch, not cleaning a rifle, but reading a newspaper from Lexington or Frankfurt, talking about the future. He spoke of railroads cutting through the mountains like steel rivers, of coal mines bringing payrolls and prosperity to families who had only ever known back-breaking farm work. His children would listen, and his wife would watch him, and they saw a man building a kingdom not of fear, but of progress. He was a Republican in a staunchly Democratic county, a man who saw the outside world not as a threat, but as an opportunity. He saw the coming corporations as partners, and he intended to be the man who brokered the deal, ensuring his family and his followers would be the first in line to reap the rewards. To his clan, Joe Eversole wasn't a warmonger. He was a visionary, the only man smart enough to guide them into the coming century. Then there was Benjamin Big Ben French. If Joe Eversole was the future, Big Ben was the living, breathing embodiment of the past. He was the sheriff, but his real power came from the sheer force of his presence. He was a massive man, built like one of the oak trees on his land, and his authority was absolute. He didn't need a law book. His word was law. On a Saturday afternoon, you'd find him on the steps of his store, a benevolent titan settling a land dispute between two farmers with a quiet word and a look that promised there would be no more argument. He was the patriarch of his clan in every sense of the word. He was surrounded by a web of kin who looked to him not just for leadership, but for protection. He was suspicious of the foreign money and the smooth-talking lawyers like Eversole. To Big Ben and his people, the coal under the ground wasn't a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder from Philadelphia. It was their birthright, part of the land their grandfathers had fought and bled for. Protecting that land and the old way of life it supported was his sacred duty. He was the wall that stood between his people and a changing world they did not trust. A man's greatest strength is often just the other side of the coin from his deadliest weakness. For Joe Eversole, his sharp, educated mind was his greatest asset, but it was also his blind spot. He saw the world as a chessboard, a place of logic and calculated risks. He believed the old mountain ways, the fierce pride, the stubborn loyalty to the past were simply obstacles to be outmaneuvered. He couldn't understand that in Perry County, honor wasn't a piece on a board. It was the board itself. He once publicly debated an old farmer loyal to the French clan, systematically tearing apart the man's fears about the railroad with facts and figures, and ending by calling his concerns ignorant sentiment. Joe won the argument, but he lost the room. He had shown contempt for their code, and in the mountains, contempt is a sin that demands a heavy price. Big Ben French, on the other hand, was ruled by a pride as massive as his own frame. It was the source of his power, the reason men would follow him into a fight without a second thought. But it was a rigid, unbending thing. For him, there was no such thing as a strategic retreat or a minor compromise. Every challenge, no matter how small, was a test of his authority that had to be met with overwhelming force. They tell a story of how a minor land dispute that could have been settled with a handshake and a jug of whiskey was instead escalated by French into a public standoff, simply because the other party was a distant cousin of the Eversoles. He wasn't just defending his land, he was defending his name, and he was willing to risk blood over it. This was the crack in each man's armor. Joe Eversole's ambition made him believe he was smarter than the old code, that he could push and prod and modernize without consequence. He saw Ben French not as a man to be respected, but as a stubborn relic to be swept aside by the march of progress. And Big Ben French's pride made it impossible for him to ignore a single one of those prods. He saw every move Joe Eversole made not as a political calculation, but as a direct, personal insult to his family and his way of life. One man could not stop pushing, and the other could not bend. Their flaws were perfectly matched, a lit fuse reaching for a barrel of gunpowder. It was no longer a question of if the county would explode, but when. The final break, the moment the bad blood turned to poison, didn't happen in a courtroom or a political debate. The legend says it happened where so many mountain feuds begin, over a bottle of whiskey and a game of cards. In 1886, in a smoke-filled room in Hazard, Joe Eversole and Ben French sat across from each other. The air was already thick with tension, but the liquor loosened their tongues and sharpened their contempt. A dispute over the game, a simple accusation of cheating or a misplayed hand, quickly spiraled. It was no longer about cards. It was about everything. Joe Eversole, with his lawyer's wit, made a sharp, condescending remark about the old ways, a jab at the French clan's stubborn resistance to progress. It was a flick of the wrist, but it landed like a fist on Big Ben French's jaw. For a man like French, whose entire world was built on the rock of his personal authority and the honor of his name, this public insult from a man he saw as an upstart was intolerable. His pride, that massive, unbending thing, ignited. He rose from his chair, his shadow swallowing Eversole, and the threats he made were not vague. They were promises, spoken low and cold, of what happens to men who forget their place. In the mountains, a public threat is a debt that must be paid. To let it pass is to admit you are the weaker man, and weakness is a death sentence. The line had been crossed. The room fell silent as the two men stared each other down, and everyone present knew they had just witnessed the conception of a war. Joe Eversole had poked the bear, believing his intelligence was shield enough. Ben French had been challenged in his own kingdom, and his pride demanded a brutal, unforgettable lesson. The lesson came a short time later, not in the open but from the shadows. Nicholas "Nick" Combs was Joe Eversole's uncle, a trusted friend and a respected man in his own right. He was ambushed on a quiet mountain road, shot from his saddle without a chance to draw his own weapon. It was a cold, calculated act of terror. There was no trial, no witnesses came forward, but everyone in Perry County knew. This was the French clan's answer. It was a message written in blood, sent directly to Joe Eversole. For Joe, this was the moment the chessboard was kicked over. The murder of his uncle was not a political move. It was an act of savagery that ripped through his modern worldview. The old code he had tried to outsmart had just reached out and torn a hole in his family. His grief was matched only by a cold, burning rage. There would be no more debates, no more legal maneuvering. Ben French had chosen the language of the gun. Now, Joe Eversole would answer in kind. The affront had been delivered, and the only acceptable response was vengeance. The blood of Nick Combs was a seed, and from it a forest of rifles began to grow. Joe Eversole's grief was a cold, sharp thing, and it pointed him down a path from which there was no turning back. Now, you might think the mountain code would demand a simple, brutal balance, a life for a life. A French loyalist, maybe the man who pulled the trigger, would be found dead in a creek bed, and the scales of honor would be level once more. That was the old way. That was the path of compromise. Elders from both clans, men with grey in their beards who had seen enough killing in their time, tried to steer the currents back to that old channel. They came to Joe Eversole, not as enemies, but as neighbors. They spoke of the cost of a wider war, of fields that would go unplowed and children who would grow up without fathers. They pleaded with him to seek a targeted revenge, to let the matter end there before it consumed them all. They warned him that turning Perry County into a battlefield would only serve the interests of the outside coal men who were watching from the hills like vultures. But Joe Eversole was deaf to their warnings. His calculating mind, now fueled by rage, saw this as a moment of opportunity. A simple revenge killing would just continue the endless cycle. He wanted to end it permanently. He didn't want to just balance the scales, he wanted to smash them. He rejected the pleas for peace, framing his decision not as vengeance, but as a crusade. He would raise an army, march on Hazard, and tear the corrupt French regime out by its roots. He would bring, he claimed, a new kind of law to the mountains. It was the perfect justification, wrapping his raw ambition and his thirst for retribution in the noble flag of progress. Across the county, Ben French watched Eversole's mobilization, and his own pride provided the equal and opposite reaction. He heard the same pleas for peace, the same warnings, and he threw them back in the faces of those who offered them. To him, backing down now, offering a sacrifice to appease Eversole, would be an admission of guilt and a show of weakness he could not abide. He saw Eversole gathering men and buying rifles, and it confirmed his deepest suspicions. This was never about an uncle's death. It was a coup. So French began to prepare for a siege. He was the high sheriff, and he would turn the county seat into his personal fortress. He gathered his own loyalists, men who saw Eversole's progress as a threat to their very existence. He sent riders out, and the French clan answered the call. They barricaded windows in the courthouse and reinforced the doors of their homes. Each nail hammered into a board was another nail in the coffin of peace. Each new Winchester rifle that arrived in Hazard was another vote for war. The path of compromise was now completely overgrown, and the two factions were marching down separate parallel roads, destined to collide in the streets of the town they both claimed to be fighting for. On the night before the battle, a heavy silence fell over the hills around Hazard. It was a cold, clear November in 1887, and under a sky full of hard, distant stars, two armies lay waiting for the dawn. On the ridges outside of town, Joe Eversole's men huddled around small, smokeless fires, their Winchester rifles oiled and ready. Inside the town, Ben French's followers stood watch at the darkened windows of the courthouse, their own weapons loaded. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, knowing what the morning light would bring. Into this tense stillness, a single figure walked the lonely road between the two camps. It was an old circuit preacher, a man who belonged to no clan but God's. He had christened babies from both families and spoken the final words over their dead. He represented the last flickering candle flame of peace in a room reeking of gunpowder. He went first to Joe Eversole's camp. He found him staring into the darkness toward Hazard and made his plea, his voice low and urgent. He spoke not of politics, but of souls. He named the men on both sides who would be dead by the next sundown, men whose children he knew by name. "Is this the future you want to build, Joe?" he asked. "A county of widows and orphans?" For a moment, they say, Joe Eversole hesitated. He looked at the faces of his own men, young and old, farmers and loggers who had put their faith in him. He saw the terrible cost of his ambition laid bare. This was his final crossroads. He could call it off, accept the stalemate, and live with his uncle's death unavenged. But then he thought of Nick Combs lying dead on that lonely road, of Ben French's public insult, of the future he had promised his people. His fatal flaw, that cold, calculating logic, took over. To back down now would be to lose everything. He turned to the preacher and said, "Reverend, this isn't war. This is an extermination. The sickness is in that courthouse, and I am the cure." The old preacher then walked into the besieged town of Hazard, past French's armed sentries, and found Big Ben in the darkened sheriff's office. He made a different plea, an appeal to French's duty and his pride. "Ben," he said, "you are the sheriff. You are the law. Don't let your own town become a slaughterhouse. Show them you are the bigger man. Offer a truce." Ben French stood, a giant silhouette against the window, and looked out at the campfires of the Eversole army flickering on his hills like a disease. He too stood at a crossroads. He could offer a concession, perhaps hand over the man suspected of killing Nick Combs and spare the town. But his pride, that unbending mountain of a thing, would not allow it. To him, a truce was surrender. It was an admission that Joe Eversole had the right to march an army to his doorstep. He turned from the window, his face set like stone. "They are the ones who came for a war, Reverend," he said. "My only duty now is to see that they get one. You go and pray for their souls. I'll take care of their bodies." With those words, the final door to peace was slammed shut and bolted. The last chance was gone, burned away by the pride of two men who had chosen the path of no compromise. The dawn came up grey and cold over Hazard, and with the first weak light came the sound that would define Perry County for years to come. It wasn't a single shot, but a volley, a deafening, ripping roar as 100 Winchester rifles opened fire from the hills. The Battle of Hazard had begun. For the people of the town, cowering in their homes, it was as if the sky itself was being torn apart. The sound was everywhere, a physical force that rattled windows and shook the very floorboards. The morning birds fell silent, replaced by the high-pitched whine of ricochets and the sharp, splintering crack of bullets chewing through wooden walls. From the ridge, Joe Eversole watched his plan unfold. The world narrowed to the objective, the county courthouse, now a stone fortress spitting fire. His men moved like shadows, darting from the cover of one house to the next, their rifles barking in short, angry bursts. But for every man who moved, a dozen puffs of smoke would erupt from the courthouse and the surrounding buildings. The air grew thick and acrid with the smell of burnt black powder. This wasn't the swift, surgical strike he had envisioned. This was a meat grinder. The logic and planning that had brought him here felt useless against the sheer, stubborn reality of stone walls and determined men. Inside that courthouse, Big Ben French was no longer a sheriff. He was a general in a siege. The cavernous rooms echoed with the thunder of his own men's rifles. The air was a haze of smoke, and the constant thud of Eversole's bullets against the thick stone walls was a drumbeat of impending doom. He would move from window to window, his massive frame a silhouette against the flashes of gunfire, directing his kin with a quiet word or a nod. His world was reduced to what he could see through those narrow, deadly rectangles of glass, the street below, where men he had known his whole life were now trying to end his. He felt the weight of his unbending pride, not as a burden, but as the foundation holding the building up. For the families of Hazard, the war was a terrifying, unseen monster living on the floor above them. Huddled in their root cellars, they could only listen. They heard the frantic running of booted feet on the boardwalks, the desperate shouted commands, and the ceaseless, terrifying percussion of the rifles. A woman clutched her children as the jars of canned beans on the shelf rattled from the concussions overhead. An old man pressed his ear to the dirt floor, trying to discern the sounds of friend from foe. The battle wasn't just in the streets, it was in their homes, a violation so profound it would leave a scar on their memory forever. For 2 full days, the town was a war zone. The fighting would lull, creating a tense, ringing silence where the only sound was a dog barking in the distance, and then it would erupt again in a furious crescendo of violence. A man who rose from behind a stone wall to take a shot might suddenly disappear from view. A figure running across an open street would stumble and lie still. The argument that had begun over a card table was now being settled with lead, and its costs were written in the still forms that dotted the muddy streets. Finally, as the second day bled into a weary dusk, the firing from the hills began to slacken. Joe Eversole had to accept the truth. The courthouse would not fall. His army, battered and low on ammunition, began to melt back into the mountains from which it had come. The retreat was slow, sullen, and bitter. A great, profound silence descended upon Hazard, a silence that felt heavier and more menacing than the noise it replaced. The smoke slowly cleared, revealing a town that looked like it had been savaged by a great beast. Windows were shattered, doors were splintered, and the courthouse stood defiant, pockmarked but unbroken. The Battle of Hazard was over, but the war had just begun. No ground had been gained, no decisive victory won. But a terrible line had been crossed. The men of Perry County had proven they were willing to turn their own home into a battlefield. They had fired on their neighbors, their cousins, their kin. The courthouse still belonged to Ben French, but the town and the soul of the county now belonged to the feud. As the last shots faded, Joe Eversole's grand army was gone. It had dissolved, melting back into the hollows like a dirty spring snow. The retreat was a grim, silent affair. There was no order given, just a shared, unspoken understanding that the battle was lost. Men carried their wounded on makeshift litters, their faces grim with exhaustion and defeat. Joe Eversole rode with them, his visionary's fire banked to a cold, hard ember of humiliation. He had promised his people a swift victory, a new order. Instead, he had led them into a bloody stalemate and left his dead in the streets of Hazard. In the cold twilight of the mountains, he could feel the weight of his failure and the burning need for a different kind of war. The road of the open soldier had ended. The path of the assassin was just beginning. Back in Hazard, Ben French walked out of the pockmarked courthouse into the ruins of his town. He was the victor, but there was no triumph in his eyes. He stood on the steps and surveyed the damage. The sour smell of gunpowder and fresh splintered pine hung heavy in the air. A dead horse lay in the street, and further down, a shape under a blanket told a story he didn't need to hear. Doors creaked open, and the faces of the townspeople peered out, their eyes full of a new kind of fear. They weren't looking at a sheriff who had saved them, but at a warlord who had made their home a battlefield. He walked the muddy streets, his boots crunching on shattered glass. He saw the bullet holes that stitched across the front of the general store, the gouges in the church steeple. He had held his ground. He had beaten back the usurper. His pride was intact. But the cost was written on every building, on every frightened face. This victory tasted like ash and gunpowder. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was not the end. Joe Eversole would not simply accept this defeat. The war would not be fought with armies anymore. It would be fought in the dark, on lonely roads, with a single shot from a hidden rifle. He had won the battle, but in doing so, he had sentenced his county and himself to a long, slow bleed. The road hadn't ended. It had just become a darker and more treacherous path for everyone. The silence that followed the Battle of Hazard wasn't peace. It was the sound of a held breath. The Eversole army had retreated, but the war had spread, seeping like a fever into every cabin and hollow in Perry County. Before the battle, you could be a man who was friendly with both sides. After, there was no middle ground. The fighting had drawn a line of blood and gunpowder through the heart of the community, and every single person was now forced to stand on one side or the other. A nod that wasn't returned, a glance held a second too long. These were now potential death sentences. You have to understand what this did to the people. The feud was now a poison in the well water, and everyone had to drink. Men who had hunted together since they were boys now watched each other through the sights of a rifle. Corn rotted on the stalk because the man who planted it was afraid to walk his own fields without a guard. Travel on the county roads, once a simple trip to the grist mill, became a deadly gamble. Every rustle in the trees, every shadow that fell across the path could be an ambush. The doors that had always been open to neighbors were now barred at night, and men slept with their Winchesters not just by their beds, but in them. And the wreckage wasn't just measured in the dead. Think of the families left behind. For the wife of a man killed in the fighting, his death was just the beginning. Her grief was compounded by shame, by the poverty that followed, and by the terrible knowledge that her sons were now expected to inherit their father's rifle and his list of enemies. The war wasn't just killing the men of Perry County. It was mortgaging the souls of their children, baptizing them in a legacy of hatred that they had no part in creating. The community, that fragile web of trust and mutual support that allows life to function in such an isolated place, was shredded. Friendships that had spanned generations were severed overnight. Business partnerships dissolved into bitter accusations. Even church on Sunday became a tense affair, with French loyalists sitting on one side of the aisle and Eversole sympathizers on the other, the preacher's words about forgiveness falling like seeds on barren stone. The feud had become a cancer, and it was eating the county alive from the inside out. The tragedy no longer belonged to Joe Eversole or Ben French. It now belonged to everyone. The murder of a judge on the courthouse steps was an act of blasphemy against the state. It was a message sent in powder and lead that the feudists believed their law was the only law that mattered. They were wrong. The news of Judge Josiah Combs' assassination reached the governor's mansion in Frankfurt, and the reaction was swift and furious. Governor Simon Bolivar Buckner was an old soldier, and he saw this not as a crime, but as an insurrection. He sent the state militia back into Perry County, but this time their orders were different. They weren't there to keep the peace. They were there to hunt. The state put a price on the head of the man everyone believed was the killer, Bad Tom Smith. And his trial, when they finally captured him, was a spectacle. It was more than the trial of one man. It was the trial of the mountain code itself, put in the dock to be judged by the outside world. Imagine the scene. A formal courtroom, with a judge in a black robe, lawyers with stacks of books and witnesses sworn in on a Bible. And in the defendant's chair sat Tom Smith, a man whose entire life had been governed by a different Bible, the simple, brutal creed of loyalty and retribution. The clash of cultures was palpable. The prosecution built its case with evidence, timelines, and legal arguments. They spoke of malice aforethought and conspiracy to commit murder. But the testimony from the mountain folk spoke a different language. They talked of who was kin to whom, of old insults, of debts of honor that had to be paid. The state's lawyers asked, "Did you see the defendant break the law of Kentucky?" But the silent question in the eyes of the local people was, did he betray his clan? Was he a loyal soldier? The court was trying to prove a crime. The feudists were trying to understand a move in their war. The community was torn in two. To the Eversoles and their allies, and to the growing number of people simply sick of the bloodshed, Tom Smith was a monster, the devil himself, and the trial was long overdue justice. They saw the law as a savior, the only force strong enough to break the cycle of killing. But to the French faction and those who clung to the old ways, he was a soldier captured by a foreign power. They saw him as a scapegoat, a man taking the fall for a war that everyone had a hand in. To them, the trial was a sham, an act of conquest by the state government in Frankfurt, which had never cared about their lives until a man wearing one of its robes was killed. He was a criminal to the state, but a martyr to his cause. The verdict was never truly in doubt. The state of Kentucky had to make an example of bad Tom Smith. It had to prove that its authority was absolute, that its law reached into the deepest, darkest hollows, and that it was stronger than any clan's code of honor. He was found guilty and sentenced to hang. Was it justice? For the family of Judge Combs, yes, but for Perry County, it was something else entirely. It was a declaration. The old world was over. The state was here to stay, and its judgment didn't come from a quiet word between patriarchs. It came at the end of a rope. You might think the story ends there, with the snap of a rope and the fall of the feud's most fearsome soldier. You might think justice, however brutal, had finally tidied up the mess in Perry County. But the truth of the mountains is never that clean. The law that had been so absolute with a hired gun like Tom Smith suddenly became very flexible when it came to the powerful men who had started the war. What became of Big Ben French, the patriarch who had turned the courthouse into his personal fortress? He was indicted, yes, but the charges were eventually dropped in a quiet political truce. There was no grand trial for him, no final judgment. The state, having made its point by hanging Tom Smith, seemed to lose its appetite for the fight. But Ben French didn't win. He had watched his world burn, his power broken not by Joe Eversole's army, but by the chaos they had mutually created. The fire in him simply went out. He lived out his days a diminished figure, a ghost in his own county, a relic of an age that had ended in blood and smoke. And Joe Eversole, the man of progress who had unleashed the storm, he seemed to have won. His chief rival was broken, and the state had crushed the heart of the French faction's enforcers. A few years after the war sputtered out, he was living in Virginia, a successful man who had seemingly escaped the consequences of his own bloody ambition. But the mountain code he had tried to outmaneuver had a longer reach than he ever imagined. The feud found him. He was assassinated, shot down far from the Kentucky hills, a final bloody postscript proving that the hatred he had helped create was a debt that would eventually be paid in full. But the true antagonists, the ones who had provoked the entire conflict without ever firing a shot, faced no consequences at all. While the French and Eversole clans were busy digging graves for their sons, the agents of the Northern Coal and Timber Corporations were busy drawing lines on maps. They had watched patiently as the local leadership bled each other dry. In the ruin and poverty that followed the war, they swept in. They bought up the mineral rights and the land titles for pennies on the dollar from the very widows and broken men the feud had created. The clans had fought a savage war for control of the kingdom, and in the process they had burned the kingdom to the ground, leaving the keys to the ashes for the quiet men in suits to come and pick them up. The killing stopped, but the war wasn't over. It just went on inside the people, a quiet, smoldering fire passed down from one generation to the next. To be an Eversole or a French in Perry County after the war was to carry a ghost on your back. For decades, the names themselves were like a brand, marking you as part of a story that everyone knew, but no one wanted to tell. Some descendants fled the mountains entirely, changing their names and trying to outrun the bloody shadow of their past. Others stayed, living under a constant weight of expectation or suspicion, forever defined by the actions of a grandfather they had never even met. The community healed itself in the only way it knew how, by burying the memory alive. A deep and profound silence fell over the history of the feud. It became the great, unspoken trouble. Men who had shot at each other in the streets of Hazard now passed each other at the general store with a quiet, stiff nod. They had to. To survive, they had to pretend it never happened. But the ghost of it was always there. At weddings, people would watch to see which families sat on which side of the church. At funerals, they would remember how the deceased's father had died. The war became a part of the landscape, an invisible mountain that everyone had to live under. And into the vacuum of power left by the shattered clans, a new king came to the mountains. This king didn't carry a rifle. It carried a ledger book and a surveyor's chain. The coal companies, the patient vultures who had watched the battle from afar, now descended. With the old patriarchal system broken, there was no one left with the power to resist them. The Hazard Courthouse, the very building the clans had bled for, slowly became just another office for processing the company's land deeds and enforcing its will. The new sheriff wasn't the head of a clan. He was a man who understood his main job was to protect the company payroll and break up union talk. The final bitter legacy of the Perry County War was written on the faces of the next generation. The sons of the men who had fought and died for control of the mountains didn't inherit a kingdom. They inherited a job. They traded their rifles for pickaxes and went to work for the same foreign corporations their fathers had either courted or resisted. They swapped their fierce, violent independence for a company paycheck, a house in a company town, and a debt at the company store. The war for the soul of Perry County was finally over, and the soul had been sold for a train car full of coal. If you go to Hazard today, you won't find the same courthouse that Ben French defended. It's been replaced by a more modern building. But you can stand on the very spot where Judge Josiah Combs fell, the threshold of justice where the feud reached its bloody climax. And if you know where to look, out in the old family cemeteries tucked away in the hollows, you can find the graves. You can run your hand over the weathered tombstones of Eversoles and Frenches, their names and dates being slowly erased by a century of wind and rain. These stones are the last physical witnesses, the silent, moss-covered proof that these men lived and fought and died here. But the memory of the war doesn't live in the stone. It lives in the stories. And no name from that time echoes with more chilling power than Bad Tom Smith. He has become more than a man. He's the boogeyman of Perry County. For generations, his story was a cautionary tale told to children on dark nights. His supposed pact with the devil, his cold, dead eyes, and most of all, his final defiant words from the gallows, "Hell is my destination, and I'm not afraid to go," have transformed him from a historical figure into a genuine folk legend. He is the ghost of the feud made flesh, a permanent reminder of how dark a man's soul can get. The war itself has become a ballad, sung not with music, but in the quiet conversations on front porches and in the back of old country stores. It's a story told to explain why things are the way they are. It's a warning about what happens when pride is allowed to run hotter than reason, a lesson in how neighbors can tear each other apart over a prize, only to let a silent stranger walk away with it in the end. It's the foundational myth of modern Perry County, the bloody birth of the coal camp world that would follow. And the ghost of a name is more than just a memory. The names are still there. You can find French and Eversole and Combs in the phone book today. The descendants of these men are now neighbors. Their children go to the same schools, and they live in a world that was built on the ashes of their ancestors' war. The feud is over, buried under layers of silence and time. But the spirit of it, that fierce, stubborn mountain pride, that deep suspicion of outsiders, that lingering memory of a time when a man's honor was worth more than his life, that hasn't vanished. It still haunts these hills, an echo that has never truly faded away. So we come to the end of the road, and the question we started with still hangs in the air. Was Joe Eversole a hero or a villain? Was Ben French a protector or a tyrant? The truth, as it so often does in these mountains, lies in the muddy gray between. Eversole was a visionary who saw the future, but his ambition was so great he was willing to pave the road to it with the bodies of his neighbors. French was a patriarch defending his people, but his pride was so rigid he would rather see his kingdom burn than bend an inch. They were not good men or bad men. They were hard men, forged by a hard place, and their flaws were the sparks that lit the world on fire. In the end, this isn't just a story about a feud. It is a timeless, brutal lesson in how a man's greatest strength can become his most profound weakness. Ben French's unshakable honor was the bedrock of his power until it became a stone that drowned him. Joe Eversole's sharp, modern mind was his greatest weapon until it blinded him to the ancient, bloody truths of the human heart. They were two sides of the same coin, destined to destroy each other, and in their destruction, they cleared the path for the very forces they were fighting to control. The Perry County War stands as a dark monument in the heart of Appalachia. It's a story of how a community can be led to tear its own heart out, fighting a savage war for control of a prize, only to wake up from the slaughter and find that a silent, patient stranger has walked away with it all. The clans fought for the land, but the corporations got the coal. And that, my friends, is the ballad of the Perry County War, a story of how mountain men fought like kings for a kingdom, and in the end, lost everything but their graves. I'm standing on the banks of a slow-moving creek in the heart of Clay County, Kentucky. It's quiet here, peaceful. The only sounds are the rustle of leaves in the poplar trees and the gentle murmur of water flowing over smooth, gray stones. But this place holds a violent secret. If you stand here long enough and you listen past the wind, you can almost hear a different sound. The echo of a quiet morning being torn apart by a dozen rifles firing all at once. It was right here, on this ground, that one of the most feared men in Appalachian history drew his last breath. His name was Thomas Baker, but no one called him that. They called him Bad Tom. For years, he was a ghost in these hills, a peerless marksman who seemed untouchable. Today, we're going to piece together the lost story of how a man like that ended up here, ambushed and alone, with nothing in his hand but a bar of soap. We're here to listen to the whispers from the past. To understand the man, you have to understand the world that forged him. Let's wind the clock back, long before that morning at the creek, to the years after the Civil War. Clay County wasn't a peaceful place then. It was a hornet's nest. The war between the states hadn't washed this land clean. It had just given old grudges a new flag to hide behind. Neighbor had fought neighbor in brutal guerrilla bands, and when the official armies went home, the bitterness remained, thick and suffocating as the summer fog in these hollows. In this world, the law from the state capital was a distant rumor. The real law was kinship. Your family name was your shield, your jury, and your executioner. A man's honor wasn't just a word. It was the most valuable thing he owned, and an insult was a debt that could only be paid in blood. This was a land of hard men, where disputes were settled not with lawsuits, but with long rifles and steady hands. At the center of this world stood the Howard clan. They were a powerful family, deeply rooted in the soil of Clay County, their influence tied to the wealth of the Goose Creek salt works. They were proud, numerous, and saw themselves as the rightful leaders of the region. They were men who expected respect and were quick to answer any perceived challenge to their authority. To them, the county had a natural order, and they were at the top of it. And then there was Thomas Baker. He was a different kind of force, a Union veteran who had walked through the fire of the war and come out the other side harder than mountain stone. He wasn't loud or boastful. He was a man of few words, with what people called a cold, glittering eye that seemed to look right through you. He was a hunter, and his time in the army had perfected his aim to a terrifying degree. He moved with a quiet confidence that some saw as arrogance, a challenge to the old ways. You could feel the tension crackle in the air on court days in Manchester. The Howards and their kin would stand on one side of the dusty street, and Tom Baker and his family would stand on the other. They were like two storm fronts gathering on opposite sides of a valley, dark and heavy with unspoken threats. Everyone knew it wasn't a matter of if the storm would break, but when. All it would take was a single spark to ignite an inferno that would consume them all. Feuds like this don't just appear out of thin air. They start with a single moment, a single choice. But the real reason, the human reason, often gets buried under decades of hearsay and legend. To find the truth, you have to dig. So I went to the local archives, to the place where old stories go to be forgotten, and I started scrolling through the ghosts of old newspapers on a dusty microfilm reader. After hours of searching, I found it. It's not much to look at. A faded column in an 1888 edition of a local paper, the text blurry at the edges. The headline is simple, almost sterile. Man shot and killed at logging camp. There's no picture, just a few short paragraphs. But this small, forgotten piece of newsprint is the Rosetta Stone of the Baker-Howard feud. The article reports that a man named Abner Eversole was killed by Thomas Baker following a dispute. It mentions cards and it mentions liquor. But the key detail, the one that tells you this wasn't just some drunken brawl, is Eversole's family name. He was a Howard kinsman. This wasn't a murder, it was an assassination. This small article is the official declaration of war, printed in black and white for all the world to see. But this yellowed paper, for all its facts, leaves the most important question unanswered. It tells us what happened, but it doesn't tell us why. What was the argument really about? The paper just says a dispute, but a dispute doesn't start a war that will last for over a decade and claim dozens of lives. To find that answer, we have to go back to the logging camp itself and listen to what the official record left out. Let's travel back to that logging camp in 1888. Picture a rough-hewn bunkhouse, smelling of pine sap, sweat, and cheap whiskey. A game of cards is underway by lantern light, a circle of hard men who worked with their hands all day and gambled with their pay at night. On one side of the table sat Tom Baker, on the other, Abner Eversole and a few of his Howard cousins. The air was already thick with a tension that had little to do with the cards being dealt. The game got heated, as it always did when liquor and pride were on the table. An argument started over a disputed pot. Eversole, maybe feeling brave with his kinsman beside him, pointed a finger at Baker and accused him of cheating. The other men fell silent. It was a dangerous accusation to level against any man in that camp, but to say it to Tom Baker was like throwing a lit match into a barrel of gunpowder. But it wasn't just about the cards. A darker rumor had been festering in the county for weeks, a whisper that Tom Baker had stolen a pig from a Howard family homestead. In a place where livestock was a family's wealth and a man's reputation was everything, this was the gravest of insults. It branded him a common thief. And now, in the middle of the tense bunkhouse, Eversole made the fatal mistake of saying the quiet part out loud. He threw the accusation of the stolen pig right in Baker's face. The room went dead still. This was the moment, the point of no return. Tom Baker didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply pushed his chair back and stood up. In a voice that was low and steady, a voice colder than a winter creek, he looked Eversole in the eye, denied the charge, and demanded he take it back. For a long second, Abner Eversole had a choice: swallow his pride and live, or stand his ground and die. Emboldened by his friends and the whiskey burning in his gut, he made his choice. He refused to apologize, and his hand went for the pistol at his belt. He never cleared the holster. Baker's draw was a single fluid motion, a flash of steel and a deafening roar that shook the tiny bunkhouse. Abner Eversole crumpled to the floor. The card game was over, and the story behind that brief newspaper article was written in blood. Paper records and newspaper clippings can only tell you so much. They give you the bones of a story, but not the heart. To find that, you have to talk to the people who carry the story in their blood. I found James Baker sitting on the front porch of his small house, tucked away on a ridge overlooking the same hills his infamous ancestor once roamed. He's a man in his 80s now, with his great-grandfather's clear, steady eyes and hands weathered by a lifetime of working this land. He offered me a seat and listened patiently as I explained what I was doing. He'd heard it all before, from reporters, from authors, from curious outsiders. He nodded slowly, a tired smile playing on his lips. "You've been reading the books," he said, his voice a low Appalachian drawl. "They all talk about a stolen pig. They make my great-grandfather out to be a common thief who killed a man over a card game. That's the story the Howards wanted everyone to believe. It's cleaner that way." Then he leaned forward in his rocking chair, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that spanned a century. "But the story my father told me, the one his father told him, is different. There was no stolen pig. That was a lie, a slander cooked up by the Howards because Tom was becoming too well respected, and they couldn't stand it. They wanted to tear down his name. My great-grandfather," he continued, his voice dropping, "was not a man who started fights, but he was damn sure a man who finished them. In that logging camp, Abner Eversole didn't just accuse him of stealing. He'd been drinking, and he got mean. He looked Tom square in the face, and he said something vile about his wife, Mary. An insult so foul that in those days, for a man to say that about another man's wife, there was only one possible answer. It wasn't a choice, it was a duty." Hearing him say that, the whole story shifted. The dusty newspaper article felt hollow, incomplete. This wasn't a feud over property or a card game. According to the Baker family, this was about a sacred line being crossed. A husband defending his wife's honor in the only way his world understood. Suddenly, Tom Baker wasn't just a killer. He was an avenger. Let's go back inside that cramped, smoky bunkhouse. The argument over the cards and the stolen pig was just the kindling. Abner Eversole, full of liquor and backed by his kin, decided to throw gasoline on the fire. He looked Tom Baker dead in the eye, and the words that came out of his mouth were not about cheating or theft. They were a vile personal attack aimed squarely at Tom's wife, Mary. It was a poisoned dart of an insult designed to strip a man of his dignity in front of his peers, to stain the one thing in his life he held sacred. The air in the room was sucked out in an instant. The other men froze, their eyes wide. This was no longer a squabble. This was a line being crossed, a taboo violated. In the code of the mountains, you could challenge a man's strength, his word, even his life. But you did not speak ill of his wife. To do so was to invite death to your door. Everyone in that room knew that Abner Eversole had just signed his own death warrant. Tom Baker's reaction was terrifying in its stillness. There was no explosion of rage, no shouted curses. A deep, cold calm settled over him. He slowly pushed his chair back from the rough plank table and rose to his full height. His face was a mask of stone, and that glittering eye of his was fixed on Eversole, not with anger, but with a kind of finality, like a judge who has already passed sentence. In a voice that cut through the silence, he said, "Take it back." It wasn't a request, it was an order. One last chance to step back from the abyss. But Eversole was trapped. His pride, the whiskey, and the watching eyes of his cousins had him in a corner. To back down now would be to live with the shame forever. He likely let out a sneer, a drunken laugh, and doubled down on his insult. His hand, clumsy and slow, dropped to the butt of his pistol. It was the last mistake he would ever make. Before Eversole's fingers could even get a proper grip, Tom Baker's hand moved. It wasn't a frantic motion. It was a blur of practiced economy, a movement he had honed in the chaos of war and the solitude of the hunt. The gunshot wasn't just a sound. It was a physical blow that slammed into the walls of the small room. Abner Eversole was thrown backward, the look of shock permanently etched on his face as he hit the floor. Tom Baker stood for a moment in the ringing silence, the smoke curling from the barrel of his revolver. He didn't look at the other men. He simply holstered his weapon, turned, and walked out into the night. He knew what he had just done. He hadn't just ended a man's life. He had sounded the first trumpet of a long and bloody war. From that moment on, there would be no apologies, no truces, and no peace. There would only be the feud. The killing of Abner Eversole lit the fuse. What followed was an explosion of violence that turned Clay County into a war zone. The feud spilled out of the isolated hollers and into the streets, and the epicenter of it all was right here, where standing now, the town square in Manchester. Today, it's a peaceful place. Cars pass by, people go in and out of the shops. It's hard to imagine it as anything else. But if you walk with me over to the old courthouse, a proud red brick building that has seen more history than any person alive, and you run your hand along the wall facing the street, you'll feel it. The surface isn't smooth. It's dotted with small dark pockmarks, little craters where the brick has been chipped away. Most people probably walk past these scars every day and never give them a second thought. But these aren't from weather or age. Right here. This is where it happened. Each of these marks is a silent testament to the chaos, a bullet hole left from a day when this town square was a free fire zone. This place, the very symbol of law and order in the county, became a hunting ground. The courthouse steps were turned into a fortress, and men used wagons and street corners as cover while they waged their private war in public, with no regard for who was caught in the crossfire. We're about to go back to one of those days, to a moment when the gunfire was so intense, its echoes are still trapped in this very brick. Imagine a stiflingly hot court day in Manchester. The town square is crowded, but it's a tense, watchful crowd. The unwritten rule on these days was that the town itself was neutral ground, but nobody believed it. Men with rifles leaned against porch posts, their eyes never still. The Bakers and their allies gathered near the livery stable. The Howards and their faction stood in a tight knot on the courthouse steps, a clear claim to the seat of power. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The spark came in the most ordinary way. A Howard man coming down the steps bumped hard into a Baker cousin going up. Words were exchanged, a curse muttered under the breath. A hand moved instinctively toward a pistol grip, not to draw, but as a warning. It was a fatal gesture. A sharp crack echoed off the brick facade, and the first man stumbled backward, a look of disbelief on his face. In a heartbeat, the square erupted. It wasn't a battle, it was a maelstrom of chaos, the deep boom of rifles mixed with the sharp bark of revolvers. Men who had been neighbors dove for cover behind horse troughs and wooden wagons, which offered little protection. Wood splintered, and the high-pitched whine of ricochets filled the air. Puffs of red dust exploded from the courthouse wall as stray bullets found their mark, carving the very scars we can still see today. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder and fear. From the center of it all, Wilson Howard, the patriarch of his clan, tried to bring order to the chaos, shouting directions to his men. He was a commanding figure, a rock in the middle of a violent storm. He stood his ground, a symbol of his family's defiance and power, directing the fire from the top of the stone steps. It made him a leader. It also made him a target. Across the square, from the relative safety of a doorway, Tom Baker raised his long rifle. He was not a man for chaotic firefights. He was a hunter, a marksman. For him, this wasn't a brawl. It was a series of calculations. He rested the barrel, took a breath to steady his hands, and squeezed the trigger. There was no wasted motion. A single, heavier crack cut through the din. Wilson Howard, who a moment before had been a pillar of command, suddenly stiffened. His rifle slipped from his grasp, clattering on the stone steps. He didn't cry out. He simply looked down at his own chest with a look of profound surprise before he folded, collapsing in a heap at the feet of his kin. The sight of their fallen leader broke the Howards' charge. A stunned silence fell over their side of the fight. The firing sputtered and died out as they rushed to drag his body out of the line of fire, their retreat a panicked scramble. The Bakers held their ground, watching them go. The fight was over as suddenly as it had begun. All that was left was the thick blue haze of smoke hanging in the silent air, the glint of brass casings on the dusty ground, and the new dark holes in the courthouse wall. After a storm of violence like the one that swept through Manchester, the official machinery of the law begins to grind, slowly and often ineffectively. And it leaves behind a paper trail. I'm holding a copy of the coroner's inquest into the death of Wilson Howard. It's a formal document, written in a looping bureaucratic script that tries to impose order on a day of pure chaos. You read through the dry, legalistic language, and it feels like it's describing a different event entirely. It lists the deceased, Wilson Howard. It notes the location, the town square. Then you get to the most important part, the cause of death. It simply says, "Deceased came to his end by means of a gunshot wound." That's it. A few simple words to sanitize a brutal public execution. There's no mention of the dozens of other shots fired, of the terror, of the fact that the town's main street was turned into a battlefield. Then you look at the indictments that were handed down by the grand jury in the following weeks. And there, among a list of names from the Baker clan, is the one that mattered most: Thomas Baker. On this piece of paper, he's just another name, a defendant in a murder case. The document doesn't tell you that he was a legend, that his single calculated shot had decapitated the rival clan in broad daylight. It reduces the most dramatic moment of the entire feud to a line of ink on a page. This is the official truth, the version of the story that's written down in the county archives. But it's a sterile, bloodless truth. It's a lie by omission. Because in the mountains of Clay County, an indictment from a courthouse in Manchester was one thing. Getting a man like Tom Baker to stand for trial was another thing entirely. The law had pointed its finger at him, and now it had to come into the hills and get him. That piece of paper, the indictment, was a challenge. And so the law, slow and uncertain, sent a posse into the hills to retrieve Tom Baker. But this was not their world. They were men of the town, sent into a labyrinth of creeks and hollers where every tree could hide a rifleman and every shadow felt like a threat. They were hunting a legend in his own kingdom, and they knew it. Tom Baker wasn't hiding. He was simply gone, absorbed back into the landscape that had made him. The posse would ride for days, finding nothing but cold campfires and tracks that vanished on stony ground. The locals they questioned would meet their eyes with a vacant, unhelpful stare. No one had seen Tom Baker. No one knew anything. But the posse felt his presence everywhere. They felt it in the snap of a twig in the woods just beyond their camp at night, in the unnerving silence of the forest. They weren't the hunters here. They were the hunted, trespassing in a land that answered to a different authority. The manhunt was a failure before it even began. Then, just as the law was about to give up, Tom Baker did the last thing anyone expected. He walked out of the hills on his own. He strode into the center of Manchester, his rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm, and turned himself in to the sheriff. It wasn't a surrender, it was a strategic move. He knew he couldn't be caught, but living as a fugitive put his family in constant danger. By facing the court, he was taking control of the narrative, daring the system to try and hold him. The trial was a spectacle of fear. The small courthouse was packed, but it was divided down the middle like a church at a funeral. On one side sat the Baker clan, their faces hard and unreadable, their hands never far from the pistols concealed beneath their coats. On the other side sat the Howards, their eyes burning with a cold fire of hatred and grief. Between them sat a terrified judge and a jury of 12 local men who knew with absolute certainty that their decision would have consequences far beyond the courtroom walls. Witnesses mumbled, their memories suddenly foggy. Evidence seemed to disappear. The prosecution's case, so clear on paper, began to fall apart under the crushing weight of unspoken threats. The jury didn't deliberate for long. They were farmers and merchants, not martyrs. They had to live in this county. When they filed back in, the foreman wouldn't look at the Howard family. In a quiet, nervous voice, he delivered the verdict. not guilty. The shooting of Wilson Howard was ruled an act of self-defense. A low murmur went through the room. Tom Baker stood, nodded once to the jury, and walked out of the courthouse a free man, his legal innocence now as much a part of his legend as his marksmanship. The Howards were left with nothing but rage. The law had failed them. Their patriarch was dead, and his killer had walked away without consequence. They knew then that if they wanted justice, they would have to get it themselves, not with indictments, but with bullets. Every story eventually ends in the same place. I'm standing in a quiet cemetery on a hillside just outside Manchester. The wind whispers through the cedar trees, and the old tombstones lean at odd angles, their inscriptions softened and blurred by a century of rain and sun. This is where the old names of Clay County come to rest. The names of farmers, merchants, mothers, children, and the names of feuding warriors. Over here, beneath a thick, respectable slab of granite, lies Wilson Howard. The stone is weathered, but it was clearly expensive for its time, a final statement of his status as the patriarch of a powerful clan. It speaks of a man of substance, a leader of the community. There's an air of tragic dignity to it, the resting place of a man whose death was never truly avenged by the law. And then, if you walk just 50 yards down the slope, you'll find another stone. It's simpler, more rugged, cut from local stone. The name carved into it is clear and deep: Thomas Baker, 1845 to 1899. Seeing them here so close together is a profound and bitter irony. They lie just 100 yards apart now, these mortal enemies, closer in death than they ever were in life. They fought a war for control of these hills, and in the end, they each got a small, quiet piece of them forever. But standing here,